Hey there, true believers. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different on this channel. I just finished the Miles Morales PS5 game, and I also played the remastered version of the original game. And I wanted to sit down and compare and contrast the two and talk about the pros and cons to each of them, so that you can know what to expect and make sure you get the best enjoyment out of each of them, because they really are both good games. That's the number one thing I want to point out, is that like both these games are really, really good. And if you still haven't played the original game, or if you're on the fence about the Miles Morales game, either one and or both, I promise you, 100% worth the time and money. I really, really could not be happier with either of them. In fact, anything that I say in this video that comes off a little bit as a criticism is more just to draw contrast between the two games, because it really is hard to find a flaw with either one of them. A couple disclaimers first of all, though. When you're comparing two games like this, one of them has DLC, the other one does not. Obviously there's no DLC yet for the Miles Morales game, so I'm not going to be factoring in like the Black Cat and the Hammerhead and Silver Sable and all that content from the original game, because it's just at that point it throws off your comparison. So the other disclaimer is that like I'm gonna try and keep spoilers to an absolute minimum, but it's almost impossible to have a video like this and not have some spoilers, so keep that in mind. I do have a graphic I will throw up whenever there's a spoiler coming, if you want to pause or skip a little bit. And I'll flash it on the screen now so you know what you're looking for. So if you see this icon come up during the video and you don't want spoilers, then would be a good time to mute it until the graphic is gone. So let's just jump right into it. The biggest criticism I've seen of the Miles Morales game is that it's not as long as the Peter Parker game, which is true. Like that's important to keep in mind. I'm not disputing that. The Peter Parker game is definitely longer than the Miles Morales game. However, it's not as cut and dry as I've seen some of the people on the internet make it out to be. It's important to factor in a few things when you're talking about the length of the games. First of all, the Peter Parker game, they really didn't have... They only had their own timetable to deal with. Like, they just, whenever it was done, is like, here's the game. But because of how popular that game was, the Miles Morales game was kind of on a timetable. Like, they were definitely pressured to launch that game with the PS5, which makes sense. But it's going to create a shorter game with slightly less content. There's still plenty to do. Another thing to keep in mind about the length of the games is that the Peter Parker game has way more forced downtime in between each mission. There is definitely downtime in between missions in the Miles Morales game, but it doesn't happen as often, and it's not as long. It feels less forced. There's also distinct side missions to do during those times, whereas the Peter Parker game is more just like go out into the New York and do things until like you trigger the start to the next mission. Also, I know we're not discussing the DLC for the Peter Parker game, but when you're remembering the Peter Parker game in your brain, it's hard to not include that when you think about how long the game is. That being said, the Miles Morales game, no matter how you slice it, is definitely shorter, and there's not the campaign is not as long. I mean, you could take that as a pro or a con. That just depends on how you feel about campaigns and how long they run, but that is definitely the case. As far as gameplay goes, the Peter Parker game definitely feels like the skills breed more creativity. You know, there's always that phrase, limitation breeds creativity, and like you are challenged as you're playing through the game to build your own playstyle. Now, you will reach max level eventually if you keep playing the game, but as you're playing through the game, you're kind of forced to figure out your own playstyle as Peter Parker. Whereas Miles Morales, if you spend all your skill points as you're leveling up, you're almost forced to go in a specific timed direction. And part of that is because you only you start to understand Miles' powers in the story as he goes along. It's not like Peter where everything is already developed. On the other hand, the upgrades to the gadgets feel way more impactful in Miles' game than they do in Peter's. I didn't feel like the first time I played through the Peter Parker game, I didn't even upgrade my gadgets. I just focused on my skills and the suit power. I will say that personally, I really enjoyed the different spider suits more in the Peter Parker game than in the Miles Morales game. They're both have a good selection and they're both really good. But I just gravitate towards a lot of the Peter Parker suits, partially because there's a lot of nostalgia there as someone who's been a fan of Spider-Man for a long time. With respect to the skills, I will say that the Miles Morales game, the New Game Plus feature, gives the game more replayability in my mind, because playing New Game Plus, which is a function in the game where you can start the game over a second time, but with everything you've unlocked that you've played through so far. And there's actually skills and gadget upgrades and things you can only get in New Game Plus in Miles' game. So whether you like that or not, I thought it was refreshing because it gave me a reason to go through New Game Plus. There's 0 missions in the Miles Morales game that are not Miles Morales. The Peter Parker game, you'll remember that there's missions where you play as MJ, and there's missions where you play as Miles before he got his powers. That doesn't happen in the Miles Morales game, which also contributes to Miles having a shorter campaign. So, which brings us to the story. There's so many characters in the original game, like it's insane how many characters they have. There are not as many in the Miles Morales game. And all the characters in Peter's game feel very impactful as well. Not that they don't in Miles, but when there's less of them, you get way more emotionally invested in the characters in Peter's game, especially towards the end. The emotional investment like spikes in the last few missions. It's kind of like Avengers Endgame. If you've seen Avengers Endgame, you know that like the bulk of what everyone wanted to see is in the last 30 to 45 minutes of the movie. It's the same way with Peter's game. Like the bulk of what you expected to see happens in the last few missions. The game makes you connect with all the different characters more in Peter's game than in Miles' game. Personally, I felt way more attached to Otto than I did what became the villain in the Miles Morales game. If you've played the original game, you know that you spend a lot of your time fighting the demons and Mr. Negative, and then you get to watch Otto Octavius develop into Doc Ock, which is really cool evolution, and it makes you feel connected to Octavius as well as Peter, which makes for a really impactful and emotional final scene. I personally didn't feel as attached to Tinkerer, but you are designed to feel attached. I don't want to ruin the game for anyone, especially the Miles Morales game, but you do get attached. It's just the Octavius arc felt way more impactful to me. There's way more of the like classic supervillains in Peter's game. Miles only has a couple of encounters with people who aren't, just the generic mobs. But that makes sense too if you think about it. Like Miles is still learning, he's still developing as Spider-Man, so it wouldn't make sense to have him fight like the Sinister Six in his game. It's really cool to see Uncle Aaron as the Prowler in Miles Morales' game. That was his story and his connection not only to Miles, but to Miles' father, and his own internal struggle is really cool to watch in Miles' game. That's something that's really great compared to Peter didn't really have a character like that in his game. That being said, both games follow this sort of same story arc where Spider-Man's job in both games is to stop a revenge plot against a member of society who's kind of considered untouchable. In the first game, it's Norman Osborn, who is the mayor of New York City in this storyline. In Miles Morales game, it's Simon Krieger, who is the chief researcher of a company called Roxxon Development. So they both kind of have that same, like, Spider-Man's job is to seek justice in the right way and stop this justified character from, becoming, taking vengeance in the wrong fashion. And in developing that, they've sort of set up this stage where the going forward, the story with the Osborns is going to be really, really cool, and I'm really looking forward to what they do, both with DLC and Miles game and in future games. I would love to see a co-op version of the game where you can have one person play as Miles and one person play as Peter. And it also, I think it'd be really cool if you bring your play style and your skills over from previous games in like a separate game mode that's harder. So kind of like a new game plus, only you could jump right into that game mode with all your gadgets and skills from previous games, and sort of upgrade on release further skill and gadget upgrades in that game mode. I did want to say just one thing about Miles' game really quick. The music in that game is phenomenal. They did a really good job. There's definitely way more emphasis on the music in Miles' game than Peter's game, which makes sense not only from a cultural standpoint, because it's Spanish Harlem and it has that like real classy musical vibe to it as a community, but Miles himself is kind of something of a musician, which is really cool that they did that. Also, one more really cool thing they did in Miles' game is at the end of the credits, they had this really nice in-memory message for Chadwick Boseman, the actor who played T'Challa in the Avengers movies. I'll throw the message up on the screen in the video so you guys can read it. But I thought that was really cool that they did that. It's at the end credits scene, as you might expect. But yeah, that's the basic breakdown of the differences between the games. Both games, in my mind, if you're a PlayStation gamer, you should definitely play both these games. Like I said earlier, like if you still haven't played the original game, or if you're on the fence about the Miles Morales game, just do it. Trust me, like full 100%, have zero doubts that you will immensely enjoy both these games. As far as which one is better, it's a really hard decision. I think personally, like if someone tasked me with giving only one of these games like an award, like the Gamer Awards and things like that, I think I would have to give it to Peter's game. I think Peter's game is the overall more developed, just well-rounded game. But personally, like I really enjoyed the Miles Morales game more, just from a subjective standpoint of like I really love the grassroots community feel to Miles' story, and also Miles's different abilities than Peter allowed me to embrace like a lot of my own personal play style, which I think is really cool. But in general, I'm pumped to see what they do in the future. Both games have been really good so far, and I would really love to see a co-op version of the game when they finally get around to doing the story they've been building with Norman and Harry Osborn. So those are all my thoughts basically. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if this is the type of video you'd like to see in the future. All of the gameplay you've seen during the video is 100% me. That's that's all the gameplay is that you've seen is stuff that I did myself in the games. And like I said, let me know if this is something you'd like to see. I enjoy doing this. I could talk about this for hours. I'm not always the best at talking to a screen about it, but like if this is something you guys want to see, I would definitely love to do more of these videos. So, hope you guys enjoyed it, and you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the games.